Welcome to Fairy Tale Access, where the head fairy's quest is to prove that fairy tales do exist in actual time rather than once upon a time. Together, we will unravel the heroes, young and old, who turn dreams into reality. These are the people who still believe in happily ever after. The discoveries will bend even our most cynical non-believers into believing in fairy tales. Hi, welcome to Fairy Tale Access. Today, I'm really excited to introduce you to author Christopher Russell by Skype from Virginia with Divinity's Twilight. If you like war, you're gonna love this series. Hi, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here, Denise. It's my pleasure.
So tell me about Divinity's Twilight. How did you come up with it? Because it has an epic ongoing war scene that is similar to like a Cain and Abel, but it's between three brothers. And it's really twisted. And then the story picks up and it really dives in. So what's your interest with war?
Well, the background for that probably came from my early childhood. That first off, I was an army brat. That I went over all over the place following my father. He was an officer in the U.S. military, the Army, and so he flew helicopters, and so that's where the aviation aspect comes from, the airships. But the stuff about war is probably, it started there, but I read a whole bunch of different books. There was the Redwall series by Brian Jacques. There was Shadows of the App by Adrian Tchaikovsky. There was tons of history and geography and different books about sociology. That was probably my favorite subject, even though I did everything, was history. And I just love delving into the different aspects of why things occurred, what political machination or what action by a different nation or power created a chain of events that resulted in a war. World War I's very fascinating on that, how the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand spiraled off into World War I. And so what I was trying to do with Divinity's Twilight was to make an epic of that same grand scale, where there is an inciting incident, the war between the three brothers 700 years before the start of the story, and then it flashes forward to a world still in chaos, still in conflict, that they haven't resolved the problems that they've been dealing with all this time. And so the general idea was we take the start, we take that history, we create this grand background, and then we flash forward and we introduce characters that the audience can either love or hate. And that's where we start to get into things with the cadet protagonists.
You definitely did a good job. So is this your first novel?
This is my first novel that I pursued publication. There's technically an unfinished work that came before it, and that was First Legion. It's a piece of historical fiction that examined what I thought would have happened if Julius Caesar hadn't been assassinated on the Ides of March. He eradicates the Bruttii family. He's very ruthless and merciless. And what ends up happening is part of the Roman Empire secedes. So you end up with another grand conflict between two different sides. There's more in Divinity's Twilight. Of course, you have 7 races running around, but I've evolved since then. But I wrote 100 pages of First Legion, and then I set it aside. And the reason I did that was because there wasn't enough innovation for me, that I could create the scenario, the plot, but things like lamellar armor or gladiuses or the Roman architecture or whatever was present there were things that I had to pull directly from the real world, that I couldn't invent societies and cultures and make them how I wanted to be, which is where I ended up in fantasy.
Well, what's your background? Because there were a lot of reoccurring themes, like the bridge between engineering, science, and magic. That was really well done and well laid out. It played out so well. And then your male protagonists, the armor that was involved. So what type of background do you have that influenced the science portion of this book?
I have a background in mechanical and aerospace engineering from the University of Virginia. And so what I focused on was aerospace design, and I also did a lot of biomechanics, which deals with looking at parts of the body and imagining them, or animal bodies or different things like that, and imagining them as mechanical systems. Crash testing falls under biomechanics. 3D printing of internal organs falls under that. With the technology we have today, you can actually replace bone or marrow with 3D printed plastics as long as the body doesn't reject them. There's a whole lot of fun stuff you can do on that side. But the mechanics and the aerospace side is what influenced the airships. There's thermodynamics used in there. There is physics. You see that they use the Illyrium, the magic resource, is their main power source. And what that does is allow them to jump several tech levels. That they're still wearing chainmail armor. They're still running around with swords and rifles, but they've skipped ahead as far as aircraft go, because they're able to produce engines that run on steam, very much like most of ours, because of the energy that Illyrium gives off. And so I just thought that it was fascinating to play around with the tech system and their capabilities because of that magic resource. And then separate from that, we also have their magical abilities, which use Manere, a particle carried on the blood. And so that's where you get into the more fantastical elements. That's the fantasy. And then the sci-fi is the magtech, the combination of Illyrium and what you can do with it.
That's crazy. Aren't scientists usually strictly science and not so much on the fantasy side? How did you combine both?
I'd say it wasn't a matter of me combining them just for this book specifically, that it's always been in the back of my head. My mother was an English teacher. I grew up loving reading. She taught me to write very early on. I knew my letters, my cursive letters, even before anybody else, because she had me with a pad of paper, just doing them over and over again in lines. But so in addition to that, like I said, I loved history from my father's side. He had a history background before he went into the Army. And then I also, there's the math and the sciences, which I was also good at. My mother liked to say that I was equally yoked, that I was left-brained and right-brained, that I did both. And so after going through my engineering education, I stumbled upon a series I mentioned earlier, Shadows of the Act by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And he does something very similar in his world, where magic takes a back seat to technology, even more so than in Divinity's Twilight. And it's a battle between the apt and the inapt. The apt are people that are capable of using technology. They're able to conceptualize it and understand it, like grabbing a doorknob and opening a door. But the inapt can't. They're just fundamentally unable to open a doorknob just because it doesn't register in their minds. And then he plays into that with technology, that it influences the introduction of the crossbow, the introduction of gunpowder, and how that's going to influence a fantasy world. And I wanted to do something similar with Divinity's Twilight, but I also wanted to have that fantastical element that people can grasp a hold of, the awe and the wonder, the spectacle.
You definitely did that. It was crazy good. You had some good social issues with morality. I love to quote you. The illusion of peace is not bought by constant fighting, but the whole book's about fighting. So it was, but it would just really played out well. And I thought you'd be a lot older when I read it.
Mm-hmm.
What are you, in your 20s?
27.
Right.
I look younger than I am. That, as you can see, I'm trying to grow the stellar author beard, and it's not working. The quarantine beard.
How did your engineering background influence your world building?
So that was, again, the magtech. The airships came out of the aerospace side. The mechanical side provided aspects of physics, the way that the ships move in atmosphere, the reactions, the friction from wind, the different elements that maybe I took into account that other fantasy authors don't. A lot do incredible research in order to make it as realistic as possible. But I was using just the sciences that I learned, thermodynamics, statics, strength of materials, how things burn, how things fall apart. Just weaving that in an organic way so the reader doesn't think that they're getting a science lesson, even if that's what's going on.
So all the elements involved were real?
To a certain degree, not the magic, of course. That's completely fictitious. That people being able to use the power in their blood as well as ambient manair to perform arcane miracles, as I say in the book. There's of course Valen, the elementalist powers, the fire, the wind, the earth, and the lightning and water. We haven't really seen the water yet. But then there's Celeste, who is sort of like a conjurer that brings in daggers from an extra dimension. There's Vel, the sylph that uses healing magic as well as controlling her blood in order to use enhansive and glyph magic, being able to project those platforms for Valen to run up in one scene. There's a whole lot of different things that my magic system is more about. It's very scientific, very hard. It's about why people can cast and the amount of energy required to cast a spell rather than what they can cast. That if you can conceive it within Lazaria, you can probably do it, provided that you have a natural inclination for it. And so that's where you get to the back of the appendix and you have the 10 schools of magic, and things get more complicated than what you just read in the text. So if someone wants to dive further into my thought process, they can go to the glossary, and we'll see more of that in book 2. But book 1 gives you a very soft introduction to the magic system where you're able to run with it alongside the characters.
No, that was really well laid out too. Everything made sense as it went along. What about the characters? Are there any characters that you like? Like, is there any one that stands out? Did you put yourself into any of the characters? How do you create these people?
I'd say that all the characters have a little bit of me in them. Valen might be my aggressive, selfish side. Mateo, timid, cowardly, intellectual side. I'd say that Mateo is most like me from 10 years ago, back when I was in high school, just getting into college. Celeste is very abrasive, very brusque, in a way that she is my id, the ego that would just come out. That's what I'd say to people if I wasn't controlling myself. She's very no nonsense. Vel is caring. That's the compassionate, the empathetic side. Leon is a great friend, a constant companion, someone that would give anything for the people that he loves. There's part of me in everyone, even some of the villains. Valeskar is one of my favorite villains, that he has a hidden soft side, but that he's also very tactical, very rigid, straightforward, that he's going to accomplish his objective. Even the three brothers, their different views of peace spiral off of, I think that there's some compromise to be had between all of their different viewpoints, but that each of those is taking what I view as a possible path to peace and taking it to an extreme. And really, they all just need to sit down at a table and compromise, but we wouldn't have a story then.
That's true. I like the way that you mixed in games, fables, and some poems. I didn't know scientists did poems.
Well, I didn't know scientists did poems either. So that was a little bit of high school. You have your poetry lessons, your units where you're supposed to come up with poems. And going back to a series I mentioned earlier, Redwall series by Brian Jacques. And he used to have tons of songs and poems and epic feasts. And there was just this wonderful tapestry of culture that was built around his little woodland critters. And I love those scenes, the amount of detail that went into it, that you could practically smell the food, that you were there at the feast, and that you could hear the songs in the back of your head. And so I thought to myself, well, there's Tolkien, that if you're going to have an epic fantasy, you had better have some songs and poems. And so I sat down and wrote those and wove them in the different places where they made sense. Like one is a coded message. One is a lullaby. that they make sense for the character or the time at which they're inserted into the story. Then you also mentioned that there was, you said songs, you said poems, there was a third one.
Fables?
Oh, the Fable. So that was taking the story of the three brothers and bringing it into the present, that the Battle of Harmouth was a cataclysmic event, that there were very few survivors. And so people that weren't there at that initiating event 700 years before the series, that they needed to come up with some way of describing what happened there. And everybody has their different interpretation. And so one of the first characters you meet, Stuart Metellus, takes all the information he could gather about the story and puts it into a fable, into something that he can give to future generations so that they won't make the same mistake. And then also later on in the book, you have the fable of creation, which there's a little bit of Christianity in that. There's some other religions as well, but that is the backstory to the mythology of the world, that along with everything else, you can have your war, your politics, your economics, but you also need to have the myths and the fables that people have told that form the foundation for their thought processes and belief systems, because that's very similar to our own world. We can look back at any nation or any people group, and they have tales that they used to tell around campfires that have been passed all the way up to the present that still have meaning.
That's great. So where is the series going, and how many books will be in it?
Okay. So this is a fun question. So there are planned 10 books in the series. So there is sequence 1, it's 6, which is Divinity's Twilight. And then there's sequence 2, 4 books that I have the name in my head, but I'm not ready to announce it. Okay. But so the idea is that there's going to be a conclusive event at the end of book 6. There's going to be a break, and then there's going to be remaining plot threads, little spider threads connecting to the next one. And so 10 books in total.
Oh, I think that's really good with fantasy fiction, because you get attached to the characters. You want to know more. You want something else to happen. You want things to finish in different areas. But when you have a lot of characters, it's great because you can keep following them. Where I think in, 20 years ago, there were 3 or 4. So how long did it take you to write the first book?
It took me about a year. And so I wrote Divinity's Twilight Rebirth 3 years ago, last August, when it was picked up for publication by Morgan James Publishing, that I went back and I did revisions, that I redid the prologue. I redid chapters 1 and 2. So I went back and made sure that all the initiating events, all of the minutia and detail that you needed for the entire series was going to be in those. So when you go through the series, you're going to be able to see, well, this connects to that. This was that twist. This was explained here, because I'm a big believer in foreshadowing. So people can go back after finishing the book, reread it and go, oh, well, that's where this character was, or this is that tie-in. That I want people to be able to find something new every time they go through the book or go through the series. And books 2 and 3 are in a semi-completed state, and those were the last 2 years. Book 2 is currently with beta readers, and the planned release is final quarter 2021.
So do you think it'll be a book a year, or do you think you'll get faster?
I think that I'm going to get faster, because the goal is, in addition to releasing book 2 at the end of 2021, I'm currently pumping out a standalone Asian fantasy novel that's going to be in the wider Divinity's Twilight universe, but unconnected to the direct events of Divinity's Twilight Rebirth. And so the goal is to get that out in 2021 as well. Give people something to sink their teeth into that isn't an entire series.
Wow. It's going to be a lot of work, because this was almost 500 pages.
Technically, it could have been longer. There were another 3 or 4 chapters I wanted to include, but the idea, we picked a good cutoff point for a rounded story that wasn't going to go too long. That, again, you're a debuting author, that you have to show that the book has merit. And I think that we've gotten a lot of great feedback about it. So maybe the next one will be a little longer. I know it's a long book as it is.
Yeah, there was a lot of horrific scenes that reminded you of different wars. How is that to write when it's so barbaric and evil?
Well, what I do is, first off, as you said, that it's barbaric, and that's something people need to see, that we have to realize as a species, as humanity, that we don't want to go to war, that we don't want to put people into these situations where they have to fight and kill and die. And yet that's also at the same time, even fantasy, something we glorify, that there are heroes that arise because of that. And what we always have to remember with fantasy is that what we're glorifying is the heroes that stood up, that they decided that they were going to try to change an evil trajectory, not the fact that they were killing or fighting or that there was this brutal war involved. We're glorifying what came next, what they've accomplished. And you were asking about how I get into these scenes. Well, there's different ways that I prepare to write. One, listening, especially with something like that, listening to some dark, somber, melancholic music, something that sets you in that mind. And then I try to put myself into the character to see and hear and smell and sense what they do. And so what I'm writing is my direct reaction to either the fetid rot of a corpse that's been laying there for days, or the blood gushing from a wound that these people are going to be, it's offsetting, it's unnerving, that they're going to have a very visceral reaction to it. And that's what I was trying to convey, that there is a response to this that even I can't imagine, that only somebody that's been there and done that can actually see the horrors of war. But I'm trying the best I can to convey that through what I've learned and through what I picture it to be.
You did an exceptional job with that. I mean, there are points where you could actually smell what was going on. It, was offensive, where you sat back and it reminded you of things that have happened throughout history, where the characters are all mutilated, like the whole army. He mutilated his own army. Just all those dynamics. It was cruel, but it was really well done.
Well, so what you're speaking of there is the prologue. And so that's not spoilers for anybody that's watching. It's what you get directly into. But Sarkon, your initial villain, the main thing that I was going for with him is that he's a combination of Machiavellian politics, the ends justify the means, and maybe a Dr. Mendeleev, a Nazi scientist, somebody that is willing to experiment and go into a darker place than any human being would dare, with magic, with magtech, with the resources that he has available to him in order to get results.
Which is still surprising coming from somebody so young.
Well, there's a quote, and I might butcher this, but the man that doesn't read lives but one life. The man or person that does read lives thousands. And so you're able, especially in today, with the internet, with books, with all the resources we have at our fingertips, a person can gain far more knowledge than they ever could before. That you can compress the time it would take to learn all this, to be able to mold it, and then to put it back out again in another book.
All right. So before we close, what about the martial arts and combat skills? Are these activities that you do on your free time?
So initially it was free time. I started doing Taekwondo, which is my martial art, back in high school. And I kept training through high school, through college, into graduate school. And so what I ended up doing was I'm now a third degree black belt in Taekwondo. That's 12 years of experience. And so during the latter 3 to 4 years, I turned around and took everything that I'd learned and I started teaching. And I did that as a part-time job during graduate school. At the same time that I was writing the first book of Divinity's Twilight, the way that timeline works. And so the martial arts aspects, they're not incredibly heavy in the book. That I talk about certain moves like round kicks, side kicks, knife hands, various techniques that people are using. But also with the weapons forms, the katana, the stave, the different things that I've learned. But I also want readers to be able to imagine the flow of combat themselves, that I don't have to expressly say every single move, that they can, if in an exchange of blows or a flurry of blows, they can see in their own mind's eye how that might be playing out based on what I've described previously. And so that is the crossover. And there's going to be a lot more of that in my Asian fantasy, where martial arts are directly important to the magic system.
Wow, I can't wait to read the next one. Well, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing so much about how you created this awesome series. We can't wait to see it unravel.
Thank you. I can't wait to get the next books to the fans, and I hope all your listeners will go out and pick up a copy and experience it for themselves.
Definitely. If you guys want a great book with lots of military action and just fantasy at its best, Divinity Twilight by Christopher Russell is definitely a great choice. We'll see you soon.